and Pedro, as well as of the Innovation Facility. I'd like to welcome you to this talk on complexity. It's now a great pleasure to have Yuen Yuen Ang with us, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, with lots of background in exploring complex systems. And her book, How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, sorry, I'm a jet lag still, is a clearly recommended read for everyone who's interested in complexity. Along with Aid on the Edge of Chaos by Ben Ramalingan, two of the books I highly recommend to really grasp that concept of complexity in development, which is of course super dominant and important for the concept of innovation. Without spoiling any major content, one of the big questions is not, do we need to become more adaptive? Do we need to become more innovative? But rather, how do we do it? How do we better respond to the complex problems of this world? And with this, I'm going to hand over. We are so honored to have you here today. Thanks so much for coming, and very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Can I begin?
Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you very much for having me here. I want to thank UNDP, to the Innovation Facility, and especially to Ben for having me here. I'm very, very excited to be here. And, in fact, about a year ago, I was at United Nations, and I participated in the expert group meeting on eradicating poverty back in 2017 at the main UN building, which is why this morning I went to the wrong building. And at this meeting, the experts had a chance to contribute a few paragraphs of our recommendations. And this is my paragraph. I wrote that learning, adapting, and innovation are central to poverty reduction. Innovation is not the exclusive domain of wealthy nations. Poor countries require innovation to escape poverty. And at the time, I thought, I wonder if talking about innovation might be too radical for the United Nations. And I thought maybe in my lifetime, this will never be picked up. And well, I am so happy to be completely wrong, because I didn't know that in fact, the Innovation Facility had already been established in 2014. And that even better, 8 months later, I will be here talking about innovation. So this is one of the happy wrong expectations that I have had. Today I want to talk about a few things. Let me start by introducing you very briefly to my research, especially my book. And I'm going to briefly discuss why I choose to focus on talking about the fallacies of embracing complexity, what not to do. And then finally, I'm going to just extract parts of my book that relate to each of these three fallacies. And just to give everyone a preview, these are the three fallacies. The first is the idea that embracing complexity means to reject simplicity and embrace messiness, to always give more freedom and make fewer rules, and to be pragmatic and make fewer changes. So I'm going to try to convince you why these three very common thinking are actually not correct and not grounded in complexity theory. Okay, so let me begin a little bit about my research. I'm a political scientist at the University of Michigan. That is my main department, but I'm also a faculty member of the Center for Complex Systems at the University of Michigan. And this is kind of an interesting fact. This center at UM is actually an intellectual founding place for the study of complexity. And it includes four major thinkers that are pioneers in the field. And their last names are abbreviated as the BACH group, B-A-C-H. So they include Axelrod, a political scientist, Cohen, who is a computer scientist, Burks, who is a mathematician, and H. Holland is an engineer. So it's a highly interdisciplinary group. They worked on complexity back in the 60s and 70s and laid a very solid
rigorous foundation thinking about complexity. So if you look at my book, I've been very much influenced by them, benefited from their ideas and research. And so this is the intellectual wellspring that I'm drawing upon. So complex systems, what are complex systems? As defined by the center itself, complex system refers to nonlinear, dynamic, adaptive systems. And we see these types of systems all around us in our daily lives. A garden plot is a complex system because it's nonlinear and adaptive. The cosmos is a complex system. The human brain is also a complex system. And most of all, political economies, societies, they are all complex systems. But the problem is that for the very, very long time, we have studied political economies as if they are not complex systems, as if they're machines, as if they are mechanical and predictable. And so the overall agenda of my research is to deepen our understanding of economic institutional development as a complex system. And to do that, what I aim to provide is three things: concepts, methods, and most important of all, evidence. Okay. All right, so this is, as a first step in this sort of grand agenda, which will take a whole lifetime to fulfill, this is the first step, which is the publication of this book that is called How China Escaped the Poverty Trap, and it came out in 2016. Now, for anyone who sort of looks at the cover of this book, and the moment you see China in the title, it's a bit strange to think that this has anything to do with complexity. Because if anything, you know, the moment we think of China, we think of an autocracy, we think of a single party system. It seems to be the opposite of complexity. So why is it that this book that features China is actually about complexity? And the reason for this is that Reform era China is actually, I would argue, the best illustration of hashtag adaptive development and hashtag complexity principles long before these became buzzwords in global development. So when the reformist leadership in China took over under Deng Xiaoping in 1978, they were not aware of the buzzwords, obviously. They don't know complexity, they don't know systems thinking, but they practice these principles without knowing the buzzwords. And we have seen that even within a closed authoritarian political system, they have nevertheless, within a very gigantic civil service, produced tremendous innovation and experimentation. So I think there are some lessons that we can draw from this extraordinary case. And I think it also gives us some hope and confidence that if a closed political system can have innovation, why not UNDP? Right? Yeah, there is so much hope for that. Yes. So complexity. Why is it that today I want to focus on fallacies, right? What not to do. And just some background. A few weeks ago, I gave a talk called Complexity and Development 2.0 at the Institute of Development Studies. So if you're interested in this presentation, which is another 45 minutes, it is recorded and posted on their website under the Complexity and Development Seminar series. And Ben Ramalingam was very kind to invite me to IDS to give this presentation. The gist of this presentation is as follows. What I tried to do is to explain the difference between what I call Complexity 1.0 and Complexity 2.0. Okay? So what is Complexity 1.0? This is the literature of which I've been very much inspired by thinkers like Ben himself, who really set this new thinking in the field, who points out that development problems are complex with no cookie cutter solutions. One size doesn't fit all. And I think back in, say, 10 or 15 years ago, it was really important that that itself, right, is announced. And that literature tells us that given our understanding that development is a complex problem, we should therefore adapt. right? So it prescribes adaptation, innovation, experiment, feedbacks as solutions to the complex problems of development. So that's very good. And we absolutely need 1.0 in order to have this discussion about 2.0. So my approach points out, and it really follows and stands on the shoulders of 1.0, that in the first place, enabling adaptation is the problem, right? If it were easy to adapt, if it were easy to innovate, we would all have done it long ago, and all our problems would be solved, right? So it's one thing to say that we should adapt. It's another thing to say, how do you adapt? And that is what 2.0 is about. Instead of asserting that we should adapt, we need to identify what are the conditions and what are the designs that actually enable effective adaptation within organizations, within countries, within societies, and so forth. And I think it might be useful here to use a term that I read in the UN strategic report. And I think the term was that the UNDP wants to transform itself from a producer of solutions to an enabler of solutions, right? And so that is exactly the conversation that I'm trying to have. So how might the UNDP or any organization provide an environment that enables the formation of solutions? So why do I want to focus on fallacies today instead of talking about what is complexity, what to do about it? Because if you want that presentation, you can go online to IDS to see that presentation. I wanted to change the conversation a little bit today because I realized from my previous presentations and interactions that I would often have conversations with colleagues who say, at our organization, we embrace complexity, and therefore we need X, Y, and Z. But when I hear the content of X, Y, and Z, I'm thinking, that's not embracing complexity. That is an attempt to do something different, but it's not embracing complexity, as in there is no a priori logic for doing X, Y, and Z, and you don't have examples or demonstration cases of why you should do X, Y, and Z. So I think it is actually easier from the perspective of learning to first understand what not to do in order to do it right subsequently, because we know that doing it right takes practice, it takes experience, but first let us have a common understanding of consensus about this is not the right way to do it. Okay, so this is why I want to focus on complexity, on the fallacies, on the what not to do about complexity today. So these are the three fallacies that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to try to go through them and illuminate them by drawing on relevant parts of my book. Okay? So this is the first fallacy. And so fallacy number one is really common. It is basically the idea that embracing complexity means to reject simplicity and embrace messiness. And indeed, if you just go online and you Google for complexity, you find a lot of headlines that say this, right? Leaders should embrace messiness and not avoid it. When there's no simple solution at work, learn to embrace the mess. Just splash paint around, try to deal with it, and be happy with the messiness. So this is a very common idea. And this is a misleading idea. I'm going to try to explain why this is actually wrong. And to explain why this is actually incorrect, I'm specifically going to draw on chapter 1 of my book called Mapping Coevolution. And if you wanted an 800 summary of this chapter, you can find my blog at the World Bank, which is called Which Comes First, Good Governance or Economic Growth? So I'm going to focus on materials from chapter 1. Okay? Now, what chapter 1 does is that it tries to tackle a very long-standing problem in development, which is that for a very long time, we debated the chicken and egg problem of do we do economic growth first or do we do good governance first? And the debate has been polarized between two camps. One of them says, well, first, you should stimulate the economy, and then good governance will fix itself. And the other camp that says, no, first you should get governance right, and only then could you have economic growth, right? So we have the debate polarized between these two sort of big arrows. And my contention to this debate is that it completely gets the picture wrong, because it's a very simplistic understanding of development. Right? You take something that obviously is complex, non-linear, dynamic, adaptive, and you insist on understanding it as one big arrow. Right? Either it goes in one direction or the other. So if you think about any argument that follows a linear logic in one big arrow, we might call that simplistic. And notice I don't say it's simple, it's simplistic, because there is too much reduction, meaning you've reduced the reality to the point where it actually obscures or confuses rather than clarifies. Okay? So it's simplistic. So when we are faced with an understanding that obviously development is not one big arrow, so what is the alternative? And the conventional wisdom is the alternative is we just have to live with the messiness. Now, one big arrow is a clump of strings. There are many players involved, arrows pointing in all directions, contextual, emergent, self-organizing. Life is messy, deal with it. Okay? And that is actually wrong as well. Okay, I'm happy to say that. Because when we think that messy is the alternative of simplistic, messy has the opposite problem. No reduction, right? It just puts all of the variables, throws it into a kitchen sink with no effort to organize whatsoever. That is not helpful, neither for theory or for practice. And so what do I do in my book? My book is not a messy theory of development. My book is a complex theory of development. And it can be synthesized into this picture, which is, I argue that development can, at its simplest, be understood as a three-step process of two arrows. And this simple figure adds a little bit more complexity into our understanding. It tells us that development is a non-linear process. It goes two ways. It's co-evolutionary, meaning that economies and institutions feed one another. But notice that it is presented in reduced form, right? So that we have a more complex and nuanced understanding of a process, but it is not messy. So let me give you some meat to the argument, and you can find this in the book. So the example that I gave is, if we go and look at the life histories of coastal cities in China that achieved a rapid economic and institutional transformation over 40 years, how did this whole process get started? What was their first step? Did they start by stimulating the economy, or did they start with best practices? And I'm sure you all know they did not start with best practices. So what did they start with, right? And so by interviewing and carrying out oral histories with veteran bureaucrats who were there in the 1980s, I found out that what they actually did was very unusual. When markets opened in the 80s and 90s, what the bureaucrats in the coastal cities did was, instead of having a technocratic bureaucracy, they enlisted all civil servants to go out and recruit investments. And these civil servants, regardless of your office, you could be doing environment, you could be doing finance. As long as you're part of the government, you go out there like an en masse sales team, call your friends, call your relatives. And if you succeed in recruiting investments, you get to have a direct cut of the investments that you bring in. So it's basically a high-powered incentive scheme. And also concrete targets were set. So every department, every agency, you do have to achieve the target of bringing in these investments. So if you look at the list of actual practices that they adopted, we would say, no, the UNDP is not going to recommend that, as a best practice. But at the same time, if you think about what they did, it was very clever, because when they were a poor and pre-industrialized economy, they didn't have a technocratic bureaucracy, but they made best use of what they had, which is the mobilization power of communism, plus the close personal ties of a rural society. So they made best use of what they had. they created and improvised this weird, but really quite fitting system for their circumstances. And this was the institutional arrangement that really kicked off the economy in the coastal parts of China. And then when you look at 2000s, the situation continued to evolve. By the 2000s, as GDP grows, the economy expands, you have more businesses. These economic changes then change institutions because they change the preferences of the leadership and they change the resources that they have. So that today, if you go to places like Shenzhen and Shanghai, you see a very different civil service. You see a civil service that's much closer to the Bavarian ideal that you might find in Singapore. But it is important to bear in mind that this professionalized bureaucracy that we see today is very different from the bureaucracy that existed in the 1980s and 1990s, right? So this is an example of a really thick description of many, many things that were happening on the ground. And it might seem messy, but in fact it's not. Because at the end of the day, I give you a very stylized account of the sequence of economic and institutional changes, which can be summed up on this slide. The first step of development is to harness normatively weak institutions to build markets. And what I mean by normatively weak institutions are norms and practices that look weak or backward by first world standards. And if you are a poor country, you have not yet industrialized, what do you have in abundance? You have lots of weak institutions. So if you can make use of even a small percentage of what you have in abundance, why not try it, right? So that is actually the first step of the development process. Step 2 is that emerging markets change preferences and resources, stimulating the selection of strong institutions. And step 3 is that strong institutions preserve markets. So if you look at this overall account, it's a different theory of development. It's a 3-step, what I call a co-evolutionary or mutually adaptive sequence. Now, going back to my earlier point about messy, now you can compare this panel of 3 distinct ideas. Simplistic does not help us because there is too much reduction. It reduces so much that you can't even understand the reality. Messy is also not helpful because there is no reduction. If it's messy, it means that you haven't worked hard enough to make it not messy, right? But what we really want when we do an analysis of a complex situation is that we want to capture nonlinear, adaptive dynamics, but it has to be reduced. So that is sort of, I hope that's helpful for everyone to understand what we should look for when we want to find a useful analysis of a complex situation. Okay. So that was fallacy number 1. Are there any questions? Or should I, let me go through 2 and 3 and take your questions at the end. Okay. So fallacy number 2. Also a very common fallacy that I hear or encounter, the idea that embracing complexity means to always give more freedom and cut rules. In fact, this is so common that just this morning I went on Twitter and checked hashtag complexity, scrolled down and looked at what people were talking about, and this is what I extracted randomly from social media. And so this is just things that I clipped out from what I saw. This is a table that says that if you are doing things in a non-complex way, you would centralize control with clear separation between design and operations. And embracing complexity, according to this, means to delegate and grant autonomy so as to maximize local flexibility and ability to handle variation. Right? So we see this very common. This is another quote that I just pulled out from the internet. It says, "Mess is not always good, but we are trying to be too tidy and too organized. If we experiment a little bit more with improvisation, with ambiguity, with disruption and new challenges, we might well be surprised by how that improves." So granted, these are all positive messages. It's good for people to say, we need to loosen up. Right? I think that these are good messages. But I think it would be very misleading if we think that at all times you should always loosen up, and that is the foundation of embracing complexity. That is not the case. What does it actually mean to embrace complexity? Now I'm going to draw on a different part of the book. This is chapter 2 of the book, and it's called Directed Improvisation. The idea of directed improvisation is that if you look at the Chinese political system as an example, how is it that in the reform era, they were able to radically change themselves from an ossified communist system to a highly adaptive, experimental political system? Is because they kept the Chinese Communist Party in power, so the formal political institutions will not change, but they change the operation within the political system. Okay? And how that works is that the leadership, first of all, changed its role from that of a dictator and a commander to a director. So under Deng Xiaoping, what the leadership did was it focused its role on how to create the right conditions for innovation among its local officials. Things like, how do we define what is success? How do we create the right incentives? How do we set boundaries among experimentation? How do we scale adaptation, and so forth, instead of telling them what to do? And these conditions that were created by the central leadership in turn then helps to foster bottom-up improvisation using existing resources among local governments throughout China. In the example that I had just shown you in the coastal parts of China. It is useful to bear in mind that the Chinese bureaucracy is a massive organization. Altogether, it comprises today of about 50 million people. This is the size of the entire population of South Korea. So we're talking about a massive task that they undertook to inject innovation, into this massive bureaucracy. And to a great extent, they had succeeded. So there is, I think, much to learn from it. So if you look at the Chinese example, it was not the case that they did decentralization, delegation, and then just completely gave up top-down direction and control. It had to be a combination of these two conditions, which in turn then gave rise to a very distinct pattern of development in China, which is diverse solutions tailored to local conditions and stages of development. So in fact, if you look closely within China, there is no one China model. You can find many, many models across regions in China, across different time periods. It's extremely diverse. And this is just a fact that we don't read very much about in the media, so we therefore do not know. So effective adaptation, embracing complexity actually requires the direction of improvisation. And this is a line straight out of my book where I emphasize successful adaptation requires a balance between uniformity and variety, that is having some range of alternatives and experimentation, but not too much. And I think this is really worth emphasizing given UNDP's great interest in embracing complexity, which is a really, really encouraging move. But to get it right, we need to understand that it's not saying, go out there and do whatever you want. Right? That is not any type of reasonable operational guideline for any organization. If you want to have effective experimentation, we need on the one hand to say, yes, let's embrace innovation and experiment. But on the other hand, we need to actually think strategically about how do you set boundaries in it? Right? How do you say, these are things that you can try out, these are things that you can't try out? And it's very interesting to think about, in the Chinese political system, how do they do that? How do they signal these boundaries of experimentation and set them up? Okay? So the answer is actually quite interesting, and which is that if you actually look at the command system in China and look at the type of policies and directives that are given by Beijing, it is not the case that it's always very commanding. Commands in China, in fact, come in 3 different varieties. The first varieties are what I call red policies. These are policies that are very explicit about this is something you cannot do. You do this, you break the rule, you will get in trouble. And it's very explicit. And then there are different types of command called black policies. which says very explicitly, this is something that you can do. I encourage all of you to do this as much as possible. Go ahead. Okay? And then there's a third interesting, fascinating variety, which are the gray policies. And China has a lot of that. Directives and commands that are deliberately vague. That doesn't really tell you what you can and cannot do. And because it's kind of vague and ambiguous, that means that it gives agents on the ground room to experiment. So they experiment, they can create feedback, and that feedback goes up to Beijing, and Beijing in turn can then decide, should we change our commands to something that is yes or no. And this thing about 3 varieties of commands is not just an idea. It can actually be measured. It can be turned into data. So as a spin-off of this chapter, I have a new empirical project that measures the amount of policy ambiguity in all of the commands that were ever issued by the Chinese government. This is a subset of it. This is policies issued from 1978, market opening, to 2016 by the State Council, which is like the Prime Minister's office. And what we do is we use machine learning techniques to get the machine to classify these documents into whether or not they're ambiguous. And if you look at the variation across sectors, you can see that it is not the case that if we want innovation, we give ambiguity and discretion in all sectors. You can see tremendous variation. And this variation does follow a certain logic. So the policies, the sectors that have the highest ambiguity are sectors in new industry, things like e-commerce, artificial intelligence. Because they're so new, it's very likely the case that Beijing doesn't even really know what to regulate about these things. So in these sectors, you find tremendous ambiguity that allows for experimentation. But there are other sectors in which there is great clarity, very little ambiguity. Banking is an example. In banking and securities, I don't think you want too much experimentation around those type of rules. The one that has the least ambiguity is special economic zones, which surprised me. I thought it would have a lot of ambiguity. But my Chinese colleagues explained to me that because special economic zones are tailored to foreigners, so when zones are created for foreign investments, those things have to be explicitly regulated. So there is a logic of the amount of ambiguity and discretion that is given out in the Chinese political system. The relevance for an organization like the UNDP wanting to embrace complexity, therefore, is looking at this chart is, well, perhaps we need to start by thinking of what are the areas in which you want to place boundaries on experimentation? What are the areas that are black, that are red, that are gray? And these are general organizational questions. It's just that China presents a rich illustration of this organizational problem. And so these are some conclusions that I have in the chapter, which is that at first blush, the idea of directed improvisation seems to be a contradiction because we normally think about direction as controlling, improvisation as free-flowing, right? But in fact, direction and improvisation are not substituted. They are necessary complements. These two things need to come together. If it's just all improvisation, what you get is a mess. And we do not want a mess, right? We want to embrace complexity. And there is something that is definitely worth emphasizing, which is that even though China does have many examples of innovation, of course it has many examples of being controlling as well. It censors the internet, for example. But what I would argue is that whenever the CCP tries to exert control, it will meet resistance. It doesn't really work. It always backfires in some way. When they tried to control the stock market in 2015 and tried to save the stock market with commands and targets, they ended up wasting billions of dollars and still not saving the stock market, right? Instead, when the CCP acknowledges the limits of control and knowledge and tries to influence the process of problem solving, it displays remarkable flexibility and resilience that are unmatched even by many democratic regimes. So that is something I hope useful to keep in mind. So that's fallacy number 2. So now we can get to the last fallacy. Fallacy number 3
Embracing complexity means to be pragmatic, and to be pragmatic means to make fewer changes. And this is something I hear very often as well. And now I'm going to move to chapter 3 of the book, so you can see the detail for a second. So the conventional logic goes as follows. Development is a complex problem, has too many challenges. Therefore, the pragmatic thing to do is to target fewer changes. I'm sure you've read this in many contexts, and I quote some in my book. I quote Jomo and Chowdhury, who wrote in a report published by the United Nations. They said that the only feasible governance agenda may be to incrementally improve capabilities on a smaller scale. A more modest incremental approach involving a few but feasible reforms may be more pragmatic and likely to succeed. Others have echoed these statements. Primarily Grindle, for example, says that in her idea of good enough governance, it means that we should target fewer changes and work toward good enough rather than ideal conditions of governance. And Danny Roderick also calls for the targeting of reforms on the most binding constraints. So it must be acknowledged that these recommendations do make sense. Right? So if we want to be pragmatic, it seems to make sense that we should do fewer things, don't be overly ambitious, don't expect to, achieve all of the SDG goals all at once. So that's entirely reasonable. But there is a conceptual mistake in these types of statements, and let me explain them, which is that we sort of conceptualize the possibility of reforms as either one of these two options. The first option is what I call the Big Bang approach. So we might think of that as what the former Soviet Union did, when they decided that they were going to transform themselves from communism to capitalism overnight. It's called the Big Bang approach, right? And if you think about it in terms of pictures, it's as if the Soviet Union had a row of squares, and they thought the next day we are going to become a row of circles. Okay? It's pretty radical, it's really overambitious, and it failed miserably. And so the response to that was the people who say, well, so let's not do Big Bang. Let's do the pragmatic approach. The pragmatic approach, it seems, is that if I have a row of squares, don't be too ambitious, just change like one square, okay? And then we might ask ourselves, China is known to be sort of an example of pragmatism. So how did China actually do pragmatism? And the answer is, if I have to express it in squares and circles, they did it this way. China's approach to pragmatism is that they made incremental changes across a range of connected domains. And if you look at the shapes, I think it makes quite clear to you what the differences are, right? And why is it important to make incremental and wide changes? Like, what's the logic behind this approach to systems change? And as I explained in the book, this logic is embedded in the notion of institutional complementarities, which means that two institutions can be said to be complementary if the presence of one increases the efficiency of others. So let me explain in very practical terms. It means in the Chinese system, when they were trying to transition themselves from socialism to capitalism, if they change the price system, you have to change other things as well. You have to change the labor markets. You have to change the agriculture markets. You have to change the state-owned enterprises, right? Because all of these domains are linked to one another. If you change one without changing the other, you probably don't get much massive systemic change. But if you try to do it the Soviet Union way, which is let's be America the next day, it's just too wild and it's too overambitious. So the pragmatic approach that is taken in China is actually incremental, meaning we will make small changes based on what we already have. So it's not too drastic, but at the same time, it's connected. So it's across a wide set of domains. And that approach is very different from the Big Bang. It is also different from the so-called pragmatic approach. And so this is how to design for systems change, illustrated in circles and shapes and squares, very simply. Meaning that if we want to motivate change across systems,
it is best to think about doing incremental changes, changes that build upon existing institutions, but this has to be done across a wide spectrum of connected domains, as we do see in China. And I think this does have practical implications for perhaps the work that UNDP wishes to do moving forward. The strategic plan talks about the UNDP wanting to be an integrator, wanting to do all of society, all of government types of system changes. So what does that mean? And I would suggest that it means that the UNDP is uniquely and I think very positively poised to really think about, if we want to change one thing, what are the related things that need to change together, right? And we're not going to make drastic changes. We're not going to impose best practices. We are going to build on what societies already have on the ground. But the value add of the director is, well, I can provide the brain to say, if you want to change this small thing, there are these other incremental changes that need to go along with it. And that is systems thinking. Not big bang and not targeted changing. So in conclusion, we've talked about 3 fallacies today, and let me briefly recap them. The first fallacy is the idea that embracing complexity means to reject simplicity and embrace messiness. And in fact, as I argue, if it's messy, you aren't working hard enough. If it's messy, it's not science. Okay? What it means to do an analysis of a complex situation is that we should capture non-linear, mutually adaptive processes, but we need to take the extra step of reducing it, of stylizing or modeling it, right? So that is an analysis of a complex situation. It is not messy. The second fallacy is that if we embrace complexity, it means to always give more freedom and cut rules. And as I've shown you, improvisation only works when it is paired with direction and rules. That means we need to think more strategically about what are the domains that require more discretion and those that require less discretion. That is at least one place to start in terms of thinking about how do we direct and channel and guide the process of improvisation. And the third fallacy is embracing complexity means to be pragmatic and make fewer changes. And as I've shown you, that is not true. Systems thinking means to make incremental changes across a wide spectrum of connected domains. And if we look at the Chinese political system and look at the massive changes that they have managed to pull off in one generation, that is pretty strong evidence of how things actually work and of how you actually go about enabling adaptation. So on that note, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. When we prepared this talk, we realized quickly that it's much more productive going into the fallacies, realizing quickly too that we as the innovation team supporting entrepreneurs in UNDP and our partners in doing development differently are very much culprits of all 3 of those fallacies in the past. And therefore we wanted to challenge ourselves, and also we realized that the question of the why, what's the business case for embracing complexity in systems transformation, is answered. We have the 2030 agenda that's clearly interconnected. We have a new strategic plan that puts an emphasis on innovation, but puts systems thinking as a specific skill that we need to foster and to execute in UNDP. And that's also really good to see colleagues from the executive office being here and being part of that conversation. Moving forward, big ticket items for us are, of course, the 2030 agenda, but also how do we operationalize country platforms? How do we look into new ways of delivering our policy services and advisory services to clients, while looking at larger systems transformation and finding the right balance between pivoting from the linear log frame-based ways of working to not going into, and this is probably where we are the culprits, too much messiness, finding that right balance to moving the needle forwards with our partners for the 2030 agenda. Open up now for questions. It'd be amazing if you could just state your name and the organization you work for. And if it's a question kind of framed as a statement or vice versa, try to keep it pretty short, please. Would you like to do one-on-one or collect a few questions and respond to two or three?
Depends on the question, so probably one-on-one.
All right,
Yeah. Yeah.
please.
Hello, Alejandro Pacheco. I work for UNDP in the Regional Bureau for Latin America and Caribbean. I have a question that I'm not sure if it can be responded now, but I would very much appreciate some thoughts there. We are writing a paper about private sector and SDGs, and we were looking precisely at the cost estimates of the 2030 agenda, right, which varies between 3 to 5 trillion, 5 to 7 trillion, and then any other number. And our assumption is that these estimates have been done following linear systems. So they take each sector and they cost each sector. Now, the SDG agenda is precisely non-linear. So do you know of any work that's being done to properly analyze the SDG cost or required investment, but from a non-linear perspective?
So my short answer to that is, do I know of specific readings or reports on that? I don't. Specific to your report or proposal, I don't. But perhaps a response or comment to your project would be that this would be a good example of applying systems thinking in terms of if we want to support private sector development, what are the connected domains of change that need to happen? So that is more of a response and not actually an answer to the readings that you were looking for.
If you happen to go through
I would be
something-
most happy to share if something comes to mind. Yes.
Henriette Kaiser, I'm from the Yuen Yuen Ang Investment Office. I have a question. I mean, thanks very much for the presentation. I'm looking from the UN system-wide perspective, so then you get a little bit more into the complexity of the UN instead of from the UN as UNDP as an organization. Because if you look at your three fallacies, they're very applicable of looking at one UN organization vis-a-vis looking at an extended family with 50 organizations, with many different ways they're organized and different histories and all the rest of it. So looking from the perspective of the UN, of being this extended family with cousins and in-laws and feuds going for generations and people trying to kill each other and steal each other's money. Okay, how do you, from that situation, then come to a situation where, in a way, we as UN collectively can help countries to make these changes to the SDG agenda? Because that's ultimately what our Secretary General has signed us up to do. So then my question to you is, for the three fallacies, reject, simplicity, embrace, messiness, does it then also mean that, for instance, for you an organization, that in a way we have to have a similar interpretation, or can we live with 40 different interpretations of the same reality, or does that just mean messiness? So if you have UNDP and UNICEF and UN Secretariat work on something, and each one has a completely different interpretation of how things work, is that messiness, or that's fine? You can have three parallel approaches. I have, of course, my own views, but I'm just testing them with you.
Right.
The second one, on your black dots, your red dots, and your gray dots, what do you do if in a UN system where some people love red, some love black, and some love gray? And you still want to do something together. Because you always give more freedom and cut rules. Well, some will never cut rules, and some cut all the rules, and some are in between.
Let's leave it at those two, okay? So we give the other
No,
ones
I want
also
to go for the last fallacy. I mean, it's because I think if you look at your dynamic with saying the three graphs and with like the houses in the back, the complex system, my argument would say UNDP takes one scare of one of the box of the changes, UNICEF does the other one, UN Secretariat does the third one. That's one other way of making all the changes at the same time instead of trying one organization to make all these changes. That's more a statement from my view than.
Thanks.
Right. I think I should take that one because that is a chunk of. Would it be? Could I turn on the slides again? Hold on. Reminder. Thank you. Wait, could I go back to the ones that show the menu? The first question was about the messiness. So let's look at the panel. Yeah. Okay, great. So your first question was about messy and complex. Now, and I think your question is it possible to have multiple interpretations of a complex situation? Yes, that's entirely possible, right? We can think about so many examples of it. A very simple one, try to write the biography or tell a life history of Winston Churchill. That's very complex. You can write 10 completely different biographies of him that tell completely different pictures of him, right? So that, yes, different interpretations of complex accounts can exist. The important distinction that I wanted to point out is that even though different interpretations of complex situations can exist, we want to be able to distinguish between just a messy account and a complex account. So if it's a complex account, it means that it tells us something about nonlinear causation. It tells us something about mutual relations and adaptation, but it helps us to reduce that messiness into a pattern. That would be a complex account, done in many different ways. If it's just a messy account that has no stylization or model or pattern that helps us to make sense of the world, then that is not useful. So unfortunately, I can't say what is the best complex account because there is none. That's politics. But we can, however, have criteria for saying this is messy, it's not useful. This is complex. It's useful, but I may not agree with you. So that's how I would think about it. Black, white, and red. It's kind of black, white, and red. Yes, a very good question. What if different parts of the big UN clan have different opinions about what should be red and black and gray? I'm afraid I think the answer would have to be that's politics. Anything that's politics requires a political solution. And so all I can provide is the thinking behind it, the operational thinking behind it, but politics always requires a political solution. And Deng Xiaoping knew that very well. So he does the operation, he changes bureaucracy. And another part of his time is how do I make sure that I call the shots? So I get to decide who's black, and gray. So that's politics, right? And then I think the last question was about the this one, right? Yeah, this one. Yeah, and I think it's really the UN experts who would know best sort of how to apply and interpret this. But perhaps, as you described, it is the case that different parts of the UN system are different squares or different circles, right? Doing their own thing. And so if that is the case, then perhaps what we need to think about is who's the one who's going to be the director, the integrator, who's going to bring together these shapes and say, can we change with some alignment? And we need to change together, because if I change and you don't change, but we're part of a team, we're not going to be able to make systemic changes. So that's how I would think about it.
Thank you. JD?
Thanks a lot, Yuen Yuen. JD from the Executive Office. I have 11 questions. I'm going to ask you. I'm actually going to ask you just a couple that relate. We've talked a lot about the implications of your work on how we as the UN function, how we as UNDP function. But a big chunk of what you talked about was implications for the kind of advice we give to governments. So, looking at the analysis you've done, essentially the trajectory you described there was from almost a terror situation of underdevelopment in a country. Right now, for a lot of the program countries we work with, we're actually in a situation where they're kind of at a midpoint. And many of those midpoints are either too much focus on economic growth or too much focus on creating systems of governance. So I guess the question I'm asking you is, if we're engaging with countries that are in that situation, how do you actually sort of course correct? What kind of advice do you give them about how to bring that back to the kind of trajectory of complex evolution that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a really important question. It's also a tough question because in that sense, I don't think it's possible to give general answer to that because it's very context specific. It
Yeah.
depends on whether the country's priorities, as you described, is too pro-economy or too pro-governance.
Yeah.
But maybe what it's kind of helpful, maybe a kind of helpful response to that, if we take some lessons from China, is China, for example, in the first 30 years of its reform was totally pro-economy.
Yep.
Right? It was really focused on capital accumulation. And in fact, in many ways, China's development model is not a good model because it was so pro-growth
Yeah.
At the expense of things like environmental protection, equality, and so forth, right? But that was the hard choice they made because they made it so clear to their bureaucrats, to the
Yeah.
civil service, that this is the criteria, the metric by which you will be judged. And today we see actually China at an inflection point. They've become a middle income economy. And we see that now capital accumulation is no longer their primary goal because they've already done that.
Yeah.
Now they're concerned about many, many aspects of governance, environmental protection, poverty relief, and so forth. And so as we speak, we see the Chinese political system itself struggling to really reform itself to cope with these sort of new and really much broader set of goals and mandates that they did not have in the 80s, 90s, and even 2000s. And so I would say I can't have a generic answer to the challenge that you put forth, but we can see that even in China's case, when they have a system shift to a different set of development goals, they themselves are undergoing a real critical thinking about how we're going to do it. It's very tough.
Are you okay with talking with another
I will
question?
mark the 10 other questions. Thank you.
Gina.
Yeah, I wanted to hear more about fallacy too.
Ah.
Okay, how do you avoid a sort of conclusion that kind of historicizes in a way that says, you know, it's not that less rules make for more improvisation and more experimentation, you know, pull back on that a little bit, go for direct, and therefore improvisation will kind of happen spontaneously, right? So that's kind of one question. Do you see what I mean? Sort of, so how do you find that balance, I guess? And what does it really, I guess what I understood from what you're saying is that keep a centralized function, but centralize the creation of conditions, right? If I'm understanding it right. So what does that look like in practice? How do you know if we're at headquarters here. So sometimes we pretend like we issue a dictate and this happens in 165 countries around the world, right? Across ministries and municipalities and, you know, organizations and opposition party and incumbents and et cetera, et cetera. So what is that creating the conditions kind of look like and feel like? What's an example of how China did that in reform era?
Yeah, so the problem at hand with fallacy number 2 is not really sort of the tension between control and improvisation. It's not that. The real issue at hand is if you are a central authority, what is your function? And under the Maoist system, they thought that the function of the central authority was to give commands, was to plan. It was a very mechanical log frame system. And they literally had Soviet-style log frames, right? And so their targets, it was all mechanical, and they thought that they could plan their way to industrialization. And so the real change that happened was that they understood that even though the Chinese Communist Party has so much power, that power cannot help them plan the way to success. So it was about changing the role of central authority from commanding to how do we direct? And direct, you can break that up into several roles. One of the roles, which I have shown you, is how do you set boundaries around experimentation? Certain things you allow, certain things you don't allow. And if you imagine that if you are an operator on the ground, without that direction, you just feel lost. Someone tells you, hey, innovation is now the new thing, go do it. And you're like, you sure? What if I try it and then you punish me, right? And then, like, you better give me some clear indication of how serious is this thing, right? So the operator does need the central authority to give very clear signals that, yes, innovation is the new thing, but this thing you can try, this thing you cannot try, this thing, yes, we encourage, give us feedback.
We need those directions. And those are things that operators cannot do. Only the leadership can provide that, right? So that's one. Another sort of type of necessary direction from the central leadership is to define what is success for this organization. And the central government did that for the bureaucracy. And they made a hard choice. They defined it very narrowly as capital accumulation. And that has negative consequences, as we see today. But it also has positive consequences because it makes so clear to the civil servants that I need only to do one thing, which is to get rich is glorious. And that's what Deng Xiaoping said, right?
So do you have Deng Xiaoping's law frame?
Deng Xiaoping's law frame. Yeah, he actually changed the law frame to the
It'd be
Maoist
good to see
system.
that.
Yeah. But I hope that clarifies. Just to give some examples of what it means to direct. So it's not attention. It's about the respective roles that you assign to the central versus the operator.
How many more questions do we have? 3. Because I'm mindful of time. If you have to leave now, please be welcome to leave. Of course, we have time. And before I hand over to you, Owen, just a plug for next month's conversation that we are co-hosting with GovLab. It's about future literacy, how to build foresight skills, with the author of an amazing book. That's end of next month. We hope to see you there again. But Owen, please.
Thank you. First of all, Ben, thanks for throwing this again. Really appreciate the innovation team doing these brown bags. And thank you for the presentation. I'm Owen Edwards. I work for the Bureau of Management Services in UNDP. And I'm looking at the business model innovation at the moment. So this discussion on the policies, the red, black and grey, is food for thought. So I'm taking that away. So thank you very much for coming today. My question is time frame. Sometimes situations can appear to be complex because we look at them in a lens of 4 or 5 year strategic plans or political parties or whatever. And that, of course, brings variety and direction.
Yeah.
And, so I'm wondering if we looked at China's, the situation from 1989 to 94, would it have appeared much more complex than it did from 1989 to 2010 or 2015?
Yeah.
So I wonder if the facts to your, fallacies, I wonder if the facts which you presented at the end still hold true when it's a smaller time frame, because in reality, when we take this to other countries, it can appear differently. So I wondered if you've done that analysis.
So you mean the last, I'm sorry, could I turn on the slides again, just to make sure that. The last slide conclusion. Thank you. So it's your question, the orange part, is it time constrained?
Yeah, I mean, so is there, if it's a short-term time frame with variety, are they still? Have you tested these facts in that?
Maybe I think maybe the way to think about it is not so much that it's time, is that this is time constrained. So for example, the fact that different domains require different levels of discretion, that fact is not conditional upon time.
Right.
It's a fact. But the ability to assign different discretion to different domains, that depends on time.
Sure.
So maybe that's the right way to think about that. So I do think that these facts that I lay out are facts. They're not time conditional, but I do recognize the constraint of time frames when you try to implement them. So for example, number 3, I recognize is not easy, right? Because number 3, you need like this one integrator that gets everyone together, sit down at the table and coordinate. We're going to make these incremental changes together.
Yeah.
I recognize that that's not easy and it probably requires time. But the fact, the underlying principle, that's timeless.
Please.
My name is Angelica Planix. I'm working on disaster risk reduction and climate change. And my question is on the incremental changes across a wide spectrum of connected domains, basically for systems thinking we were talking about. And the question I have with this is, so you're pushing some changes across a wide spectrum, but you don't know what is the impact of these changes that you are releasing or starting, kickstart, maybe that's the best word. So basically, so all of this will have ripple effects And we don't know, will this be the intended ripple effect or maybe actually a negative one? So what analysis is required to anticipate all these many incremental changes across a wide spectrum of areas to ensure that we stay on track with the change?
Yeah, that's a really good follow-up operational challenge. But maybe a response to that would be the reason why I recommend incremental changes versus a big bang is that if you do massive changes across the board, those effects you have a really hard time predicting, right? And it could be a complete disaster, and trying to reverse it would be really, really hard. And that's the benefit of incremental changes, making a small change based on what you have. Because if you make a mistake, it's much easier for you to take one step back than to take 100 steps back. So that's why incremental changes make it easier to manage change because it's easier to course correct, right? But if it's just incremental change in one small part with no connection to the other connected domains, and very oftentimes we see very little systemic changes across the board. So that's how I think about it. But the operational challenge you lay out about evaluating across systems, that I haven't thought about, but I think maybe the UNDP could invent that.
It's just to say one more thing, because it's requires capacity to even monitor small incremental changes that should starting.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there is a tremendous investment of information collection, for example, within China's bureaucracy. Yeah, and for precisely the reasons that you have pointed out. Yeah.
Thanks for that question. That's close to our heart as the innovation team too, how to better monitor and how to plan for unintended and negative consequences. We have one more question here. Paula, before I give the floor to you, we have a question online I'd like to ask. It's from colleagues from UNDP Nigeria. And they say that in their experience, complexity in public service delivery is associated with inefficiency and delayed implementation. And they don't really know how to marry the two, being a development partner of choice that supports efficient public service delivery and embracing complexity.
I'm sorry, the question again is that complexity is often associated with inefficiency. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah, and then how to deal with it.
Okay. So my response to that would be that complexity itself is just a reality. So it's not, complexity is not inefficient, right? So as I've explained, it's just a reality that we need to manage, that we need to understand. But the feelings of inefficiency that we get is because we do not know how to manage that complexity. So it's not complexity equals inefficiency. And I think we need to kind of get that straight, because otherwise we would be like, I don't want to do complexity because I thought it's about inefficiency. So we're not doing inefficiency. So just to clarify that. Because they are, because this is UNDP in Nigeria, you said, the final chapter of my book actually is comparative. So it takes the theory and it brings it to other countries, and Nigeria is one of them. So I have a case study of a surprising, unpredictable, complex situation, which is the rise of Nollywood in Nigeria, right? And it's a situation where, and I think this is really emphasized, but Nollywood has been such a success. It is actually the second largest source of employment after agriculture, purportedly the second largest source of exports after oil, provides a lot of good jobs for young people, and this whole industry flourished without intellectual property rights in place. Right? And certainly no government planning, certainly no subsidies, nobody engineered this thing. So it's a very classic case of emergence and complexity. And I think from the case, what we can learn is that I think an important distinction to make is that in the case of China, the agents of innovation and adaptation tend to come from the government because they are an authoritarian system. They hold the power. So innovation comes from them. In places like Nigeria, as you see in Nollywood, the agents of innovation are society. Because the government by design is supposed to be limited and weak, but society is supposed to be free and vibrant. And so the rise of Nollywood was not the result of government action, unlike in China. It
It was simply the result of the adaptive actions of Nigerian filmmakers. So I think in advising public sector reforms in places like Nigeria, we need to be clear about what is it that the public sector can realistically do. Right? They cannot act like the Chinese government because by political design, they are supposed to be limited. So we need to think about, well, who are the agents of innovation in a country like Nigeria? How can the government support them, but not actually substitute for the role of social actors? So that's politically, contextually different from China because of their political systems.
Thank you for that. And that note, also a book recommendation, How Change Happens by Duncan Green, who focuses very much on systems change from that perspective.
That's right.
And he wrote a review of your book on his
It's
blog.
very kind to write a review.
And kind of ended with a spoiler to And Nollywood in Nigeria, another example of complexity emergence. So then, Paola, the last question to you.
Okay, so thanks so much for the presentation, especially on the first fallacy. I remember that years ago we were really struggling in the context of the Human Development Report to try to go beyond the idea of this trade-off and really to identify policies that would advance at the same time like different type of goal, like social topic. I think this point should be central to all the kind of analysis that we like to do. But my question to you is more about, have you tried to apply this kind of model in crisis sectors, crisis context, like conflicts or these kind of things? And I'm asking because thinking through it, I mean, the idea that comes to my mind is that in crisis context, sometimes trade-offs are unavoidable. It's also like more difficult to have like an authority that can set boundary, to change like going around. And also in terms of like incremental change, sometimes it's just like not possible because of the amount of disruption, right?
Right.
So have you tried to see like how, but yet they are complex systems and they require like a complex analysis and complex solutions. So how would this like?
I think that is a really, really great point, and it would be a standalone research project, because you're right that I think it's a research about how do we manage complexity in fragile states, right? Maybe that's the right way, which is a very different context because of the crisis, the conflict, the urgency of the problems at hand. I believe that some of the underlying principles that I lay out here might still be helpful. And I do know that there are many colleagues working on fragile states. I think one of my colleagues, Jonathan Papalides, we were on the same panel, and we've been discussing the possibility of scaling adaptation in fragile states. So those are some of the issues that we've been exploring. But I think maybe one of the takeaway thoughts from the conversation would be that I think so far when we think about fragile states, we often think that all they need is, we need to focus only on sort of like emergency measures, which we do. But we also think about in fragile states that we could actually mobilize local innovation and local adaptation. And might these things actually be scalable? These are just possibilities. And I don't know if that can be done, how it can be done. But I think that's something to think about, that perhaps the management of fragile states may not necessarily be only about emergency measures, but it could actually be about creating an ecosystem that supports local innovation from the ground.
Thank you. And with that, I'm saying thank you, Yuen Yuen. Thanks so much for this talk. We had a good number of people online. Thanks everybody online, and thanks Etty for managing that. Thanks Malika, Sophia, and Mariam. And I hope we hope to see you next month for Future Literacy, and in between for any conversation on innovation on the 16th floor. Thank you.
Great.
She